She once lived in the shadows of an old stone house, called by a name they gave her, Cinderella. They made her light the fires, scrub the floors, mend the gowns, and stripped her not just of fine clothes, but of her real name. They laughed at her dreams and told her she would never be anything more than dust and ashes. But then, on the coldest night of the year, while the whole kingdom danced beneath golden chandeliers, she walked alone into the forgotten garden, beneath the hazel tree her mother once loved, and whispered one last wish, not even daring to hope. And in that moment, the wind stirred, a glow appeared, a woman stepped out from the mist. "I am your godmother," she said, "and I've seen everything. This isn't just a story about a sparkling gown or glass slippers. It's the story of a forgotten heart, reclaiming her true name." There was once a quiet estate nestled between woodlands and gentle hills, where a girl named Arabella lived with her father Malcolm. Their home wasn't grand, but it held something far more precious than wealth: memory. The stone walls were worn smooth by time, the floors warmed by laughter, and the air carried a gentle hush, as if holding its breath for stories never told aloud. Arabella had grown up without a mother. The woman had passed when Arabella was just a baby, leaving behind a trail of kindness that lived on in whispers. Malcolm, though a reserved man, would speak of her often. "She wasn't just beautiful," he'd say, his voice softening like old velvet. "She made beauty wherever she went." And when Arabella looked into the garden her mother had designed, she believed him. The garden wasn't large or wild, it was tender. That's what Arabella thought, even as a child. It felt like something loved into being. Curved hedges lined the path with deliberate grace. There was a fountain, not grand but musical, and a single hazel tree that caught sunlight in the morning like it was made of light itself. She had once asked her father why the garden made her heart ache, and he had only smiled. "Because it remembers," he said. Arabella would sit on the worn stone bench beneath the hazel tree for hours, her faithful dog Henry curled at her feet, listening to the bees hum in the lavender and the soft splash of the fountain. Sometimes the breeze would shift just so, and the wind would smell like jasmine and cinnamon, her mother's scent, her father said. That was how she felt her mother, not in pictures, but in scents, in petals, in silence. Their life was simple. Malcolm was no baron, but he was respected. He managed the estate with quiet diligence, and the staff was small, just cook and her daughter Clara, who came in from the village each morning. Arabella was taught at home, her days filled with books and music and long walks where Henry would chase shadows through the garden like they were butterflies. Though the house was old and the walls sometimes creaked with wind, Arabella never feared it. It was, in every sense, a home. But even homes can ache with absence. As she grew older, Arabella learned to hide the loneliness that sometimes visited her in the hush between chapters of a book, or when the sun cast golden light through the window, but no one was there to share it. Her father tried. He truly did. But there were some things even love couldn't replace. When Arabella turned 15, the air in the house changed. It was subtle at first. Malcolm speaking more frequently of companionship, of age, of memory. "You're growing so fast," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. "The house feels too quiet these days. Arabella looked up, searching his face. There was something wistful in his eyes. She knew what was coming, though he hadn't said it. And then, not long after, it happened. Malcolm began calling on a woman named Lydia. She was a widow herself, with 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Agnes and Imogen. Lydia was polished, precise, always wearing gloves even when there was no chill in the air. Her smile was soft, but her eyes were unreadable. Agnes was the eldest by 2 years, sharp-featured and silent when adults were near, but sly and sharp when alone with Arabella. Imogen was closer to Arabella's age, but preferred mirrors to books and gowns to gardens. Arabella, with her dirt-stained fingers and wind-tangled hair, felt foreign to them from the first day. Still, she tried. She offered them tea in the parlor and asked about their travels. They responded with clipped sentences, and looks passed between them like secrets Arabella would never be allowed to share. When Malcolm announced the engagement, Arabella smiled. She did. She even embraced Lydia with trembling arms and said she was happy for them, because she was, in part. Her father deserved joy. But that night, she crept into the garden and wept beneath the hazel tree. Henry sat beside her, his head on her lap, watching the stars. The world wasn't ending, she told herself. It was just shifting. The wedding was quiet, held in the chapel just beyond the orchard. Arabella wore a dress her mother had sewn years before, and in the soft candlelight, she imagined her mother standing there too, whispering her blessing from the folds of the trees. When the new family moved in, everything changed. Lydia brought trunks of silks and linens. Agnes demanded Arabella's bedroom, and Imogen claimed the room across the hall. Arabella offered hers politely. She didn't cry when Agnes dumped her belongings all over the lace curtains her mother had once hemmed. She simply moved into a smaller room, one with a window overlooking the garden. It was enough. The garden, always the garden, held her steady. In it, she was still Arabella, not a guest in her own house, not a stranger among strangers, but her mother's daughter, a keeper of something quiet and sacred. And beneath the hazel tree, the wind still smelled like jasmine. The sound of trunks being dragged across the foyer echoed like thunder through the house. Arabella stood on the landing, hands folded neatly before her, watching as her father helped Lydia up the stairs. Behind them came Agnes and Imogen, whispering behind lace-gloved hands, their eyes scanning the home like treasure hunters. Arabella wondered what they saw when they looked at the place she loved so dearly. If they could sense the history in its corners, or if they only noticed the cracks in the stone and the outdated furniture. She doubted they saw the garden. "I'll take this one," Agnes announced, pointing toward Arabella's room without waiting for a response. Arabella nodded. "It has a lovely view of the fountain," she offered, her voice soft and steady. She didn't flinch when Agnes breezed past her and tossed a bonnet onto her pillow like it were already hers. Malcolm gave Arabella a grateful glance, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. He knew what she was giving up. Arabella's new room was smaller. Cozy, some might say. But she didn't mind. The window faced her mother's garden, and in the early mornings, the sun would slip through the branches of the hazel tree and land right across her quilt. It was enough. She tried, in the first weeks, to build bridges. She complimented Imogen's braids, asked about Agnes's embroidery. But the sisters rarely included her in conversation. and when they did, it was only to correct her or dismiss her ideas with bored expressions. "It's odd, don't you think," Imogen had once said over tea, "to spend so much time with flowers, like playing pretend?" Arabella smiled politely. "My mother loved the garden. She said it reminded her that something beautiful can grow in silence." Agnes scoffed. "That's very poetic," she replied, and Arabella couldn't tell whether it was meant as praise or mockery. Even Henry, her loyal terrier, seemed wary of them. He growled softly whenever Imogen drew too close, and Arabella noticed he always slept near the garden door, as though guarding the only part of their world that remained untouched. But life moved on, as it always does. The household adjusted to its new rhythm. Clara and her mother did their best to keep up with the growing list of tasks, but it was clear the workload had doubled, while their staff remained the same. Lydia insisted on formality at all meals. She found fault in the silverware arrangement, the tablecloth length, even the way Clara curtsied when entering the room. "It's important," she told Malcolm over dinner, "that we maintain standards. A household is only as respectable as its presentation." Malcolm had nodded, distracted, his fingers resting on the edge of his wineglass. Arabella knew that look. He was trying to reconcile the warmth he remembered from his first marriage with the frost that now settled across the dining room. Arabella missed the easy companionship they once shared. Now, conversation was limited to brief exchanges in the hall or quiet chats over tea when Lydia and her daughters had gone visiting. "Do you miss her?" she asked one evening as they stood in the garden. Malcolm glanced toward the hazel tree, then back at his daughter. "Every day," he whispered. "But I'm trying, for you, for us all, to build something new." She nodded. She understood, but understanding didn't make it easier. The sisters brought a different kind of weather into the house, not storms, but a chill that seeped into everything. There were no outbursts, no open cruelty, just glances exchanged across rooms, invitations not extended, laughter that fell quiet when Arabella entered. Even Clara began to sense it. "You're not one of them," she said one afternoon as they folded linens together in the sunroom. "But they want to make you feel like you should be." Arabella looked down at her hands. "They don't really know me." "They don't want to," Clara replied. Still, Arabella kept her composure. She lit the hearth each morning, arranged flowers at the breakfast table, and kept the books of the household when her father was away on errands. She was, as always, dependable, graceful, quiet, the way her mother had taught her to be. But at night, in the safety of her little room, she sometimes curled into her blankets and wondered how much longer she'd feel like a guest in her own life. It was during one of those sleepless nights that she crept down to the garden. The moon was full, and the fountain whispered, as it always did. She sat on the stone bench beneath the hazel tree, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, Henry curled at her side. And then, so softly she might have imagined it, the wind shifted. It carried a scent she hadn't smelled in years, lavender and jasmine, her mother's perfume. She closed her eyes. For a moment, just one, she felt a presence in the garden. Not a voice, not a sound, just a warmth, a knowing. When she opened her eyes, everything looked the same, but something inside her had changed. "I won't lose this," she whispered to the stars. No matter what comes, this will always be mine." And the hazel tree, as if in answer, dropped a single golden leaf at her feet. Spring had only just begun when Malcolm shared the news. They were seated in the parlor, the windows cracked open to let in the scent of rain-soaked earth. Arabella was mending a hem, her needle slipping through the fabric with quiet rhythm. Lydia sat across the room, sipping her tea too loudly, flipping through a fashion booklet, pretending not to listen. "I'll be leaving," Malcolm said softly. "In a week." Arabella looked up. "Leaving?" He nodded, his smile small but determined. "There's an investment opportunity overseas. Something promising." Lydia's teacup clinked. "How long will it take?" "A few months," he answered. "Maybe a little more." Arabella's breath caught in her throat. "You'll miss the summer." "I know," he said gently. "But it's important, and I need you to be strong." The words settled like a stone in her chest. He spoke with such faith in her, as if she were already grown, already capable of bearing burdens she'd never asked for. And maybe she was. Maybe she always had been. But hearing it from his lips made her feel both proud and hollow. "I'll take care of everything," she promised, steady as always. He reached for her hand. "I know you will." In the following days, the house bustled with preparation. Lydia wasted no time in composing a list of things Malcolm should bring her: silks, perfumes, maybe a new lady's maid if he could find one. Agnes and Imogen argued over which color dresses best suited their complexions, should he find anything fashionable in the cities he visited. Arabella said nothing. She only helped him pack. The morning of his departure, rain fell in silver sheets. Arabella stood with him on the steps, soaked to the bone. She didn't care. She needed him to see her face, to remember it exactly as it was before he disappeared into the gray. He kissed her forehead, then turned and climbed into the waiting carriage. She waved until he vanished. The moment the carriage turned down the lane, Lydia turned briskly on her heel and went inside. Agnes and Imogen followed without a word. Arabella stood alone for several minutes longer, the rain tracing paths down her cheeks. She couldn't tell which droplets came from the sky and which were tears. That night, she lit a small fire in her room, wrapped herself in her mother's shawl, and whispered into the dark, "Come back to me, please." But no answer came. The days grew longer, and the house grew colder. At first, Lydia pretended to be in mourning over Malcolm's absence, but it didn't last. Soon she was redecorating rooms, selling off trinkets, and lamenting that Arabella's presence was an unnecessary drain on the household. Clara and her mother were given more chores. So was Arabella. Eventually, the worst happened. Arabella was returning from the village market when she saw Clara leaving, her apron folded, her eyes brimming with unspilled tears. "They dismissed me," Clara said softly. "Said there was no more need." Arabella wanted to scream. Instead, she placed a hand on her friend's shoulder, offered her what little coin she had in her pocket, and watched her go. She already knew what this meant. There would be no replacement made. The work would fall to her now. By that evening, Imogen was calling her Cinderella. She didn't even say it with venom at first, just a sneer, a joke between sisters. "You're covered in ash," she laughed. Cinderella. The name stuck. Lydia didn't stop it. She encouraged it in her own way, leaving extra tasks on the list. critiquing Arabella's appearance, suggesting she was too old to be idle. So Arabella swept, she scrubbed, she polished silver and boiled linens, and carried water up 3 flights of stairs. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and still she kept going. Because she had made a promise, because she believed her father would return. In quiet moments, when the house was asleep, she went to the garden. She sat beneath the hazel tree and pressed her palms to the ground, where her mother's memory still lingered. She remembered the box she had hidden years ago, her mother's jewelry safely buried beneath the roots. She had once feared it would be stolen. Now she feared it would be all she had left. Henry always followed her there. He would curl beside her feet, guarding her like a knight in miniature armor. He never barked. He simply stayed. Time passed, as it does, without asking permission. Letters from Malcolm arrived, then stopped. Months turned into seasons, and the seasons turned cruel. Arabella became a ghost in her own home, quiet, unseen, but always moving. She grew older, more tired, but not bitter. There was still beauty in the world. She saw it in Henry's eyes, in the glow of firelight, in the way morning sun danced through the misty panes. She saw it in her mother's garden, which still bloomed each spring, no matter how much was taken from her. She held on to that beauty like a lifeline, even when hope felt thin, even when no letters came, even when her name, Arabella, was no longer spoken aloud, and only Cinderella echoed through the halls. Still, she believed, and the hazel tree stood watch. As if it believed, too, autumn passed in silence. Winter settled in like a sigh, curling around the estate in white sheets of frost. Inside the house, the cold seemed to seep into everything, into the walls, the floorboards, even the voices. Conversations grew sharper. Lydia's discontent curdled into blame, and Arabella, Cinderella, absorbed it all like stone absorbing rain. She no longer expected kindness, only tasks. Fetch more wood. Scrub that stain. Clean the soot from my sleeves, Cinderella. The name no longer hurt. It was simply a shadow she wore. Still, at night, when the embers glowed and her chores were done, she returned to the garden. The fountain had long frozen, its waters captured mid-drift like a spell cast mid-sentence. The hazel tree's limbs reached toward the sky, bare, brittle, and beautiful in their starkness. Cinderella would sit on the cold stone bench. Henry pressed beside her and whisper nothings into the air. Sometimes it felt like the garden listened. Sometimes she almost heard a reply. One snowy evening, as twilight draped its violet curtain over the sky, a letter arrived at the manor. Lydia read it aloud, standing in the grand hallway with theatrical flair. Agnes and Imogen gathered eagerly. "The royal family," she said, drawing out each syllable, "will be spending the season at their country estate." Arabella stilled. "They are hosting a ball," Lydia continued, "an occasion for young ladies to be presented." A silence dropped over the room, thick and anticipatory. Agnes squealed. Imogen clapped. Arabella said nothing. She knew what this meant. In the days that followed, the manor transformed into a theater of vanity. Ribbons, laces, half-finished gowns littered the parlor. Lydia pawned off another heirloom for fabric. Agnes practiced curtsying in front of the mirror. Imogen tried on every hairstyle from a borrowed magazine. Cinderella sewed. She adjusted hems, stitched bodices, restarched collars, her fingers raw and aching by nightfall. But no one thanked her. No one asked if she wished to attend. They didn't need to. The silence spoke clearly. She was not invited. And so, the night of the ball came. The carriage stood outside, its borrowed wheels gleaming. Agnes and Imogen were dressed in layered silks, their cheeks flushed with ambition. Lydia gave last-minute instructions with the air of a general before battle. Cinderella stood at the top of the stairs, invisible. She watched them descend, laughter echoing behind them like perfume. Then they were gone, and she was alone. She walked slowly to her mother's garden. The moon had risen, clear, cold, full. It bathed the hazel tree in silver light. Cinderella sat at the bench, pulling her shawl close, and let the wind tangle her hair. Henry rested his head in her lap. "I don't suppose," she whispered, "you can make me a dress." Henry looked up at her, tail flicking softly. She smiled despite herself. "Didn't think so." But then, something shifted. The wind stopped, or rather changed. It was no longer a winter breeze, but something warmer, older, familiar. It stirred the hazel branches, coaxing them into a rustle like music. And then, from behind the tree, the air shimmered. Cinderella sat up. A glow emerged, gentle, golden, trembling like candlelight in a sacred chapel. From within it, a woman stepped forward. Not young, not old. Her gown shimmered like morning mist. Her eyes sparkled with the memory of stars. Cinderella gasped. Who are you?" The woman smiled. "I am your godmother, child." Her voice was calm thunder, both powerful and soft. She stepped closer, reaching a hand toward Cinderella's cheek but not quite touching. "You are brave," she said. "You have suffered with grace, and tonight I will give you one gift." Cinderella's lips parted, breath caught. The godmother turned toward the hazel tree and made a sweeping gesture. Light spilled from the branches, and there, hanging like a dream, was a gown, golden, with threads that caught the moon and reflected it back as fire. Beneath it, slippers like sunlight carved into glass, and nestled in the crook of a branch, a necklace. Cinderella stood, trembling. "But how?" "No time for questions, my dear," the godmother said with a wink. "We must work quickly." She waved her hand, and magic danced. Cinderella's rags melted away, transformed into shimmering silk. Her hair lifted into perfect curls. The necklace clasped itself around her neck. The slippers formed to her feet like they had been waiting all her life. A warm breeze circled her. Cinderella spun in place, the dress floating like smoke. Henry barked joyfully. The godmother turned toward the garden path. "Now! The carriage!" A pumpkin began to swell. 2 squirrels stood upright. A coach appeared, elegant, tall, waiting. Henry transformed, standing tall, clothed in coachman's garb, his ears still perked. Cinderella laughed in awe. "You're coming too?" He wagged his tail proudly. The godmother's tone softened. "One warning, Arabella." The name made her freeze. "At midnight, all this disappears. Be home by then, or all will be as it was." Cinderella nodded, her heart pounding. She stepped toward the coach, then turned back. "How can I ever repay you?" The godmother only smiled. "By remembering who you are." And with that, the carriage door opened. Cinderella stepped inside. The stars shimmered overhead. The wheels began to turn, and the girl who once whispered to a frozen garden was on her way to a royal ball. The road to the palace shimmered beneath the wheels. Snowflakes danced in the lantern light, drifting like ash from stars too ancient to name. Wrapped in a velvet cloak, Cinderella leaned into the warmth of the carriage, watching as trees flickered past like ghosts. Her heart was a wild drum, beating not just with wonder, but with the fragile ache of hope. She had dreamt of this, danced with it in silence for years. Now, the dream was moving faster than her breath could catch. When the coach finally slowed, she leaned forward. The palace loomed ahead like a vision out of another lifetime. Marble and gold, spires tipped with starlight. 1,000 glowing windows blinked through the dark, and the air shimmered with the music of strings and laughter. Henry turned in his coachman's livery and opened the door, offering her his paw like a hand. She stepped down slowly, slippers kissing the frozen steps. As she reached the grand entrance, a footman bowed, enchanted. "My lady," he whispered, but she did not answer. She simply walked. Inside, chandeliers poured golden light across the ballroom like melted sunlight. Every inch of the space gleamed, polished floors, diamond sconces, embroidered tapestries. And amid the opulence, men and women floated in silks and velvets, glittering like stars come to dance. Cinderella stood at the threshold, unsure whether she belonged, until the music rose and every head turned. She wasn't trying to be seen, but magic, real magic, cannot be hidden. The prince saw her first. He was seated near the dais, flanked by his mother and father, but his gaze, like an arrow tipped with longing, found her immediately. He stood, wordless, eyes never leaving hers. A hush swept the room. She moved toward him, gliding more than walking. Her gold gown caught the candlelight, scattering it in shards. The whispers grew as she passed, but she heard none of them. Only the soft pounding of her heart. Only him. When she reached him, he offered his hand. "May I?" he said, voice low, eyes filled with awe. She smiled, curtsied, and answered simply, "Yes." They began to dance. It was not a performance. It was a remembering, as if their souls had known this rhythm long before their bodies met it. The prince moved with a gentle precision, guiding her across the floor like a secret waltz. Cinderella, who had not danced in years, found her feet remembering steps her heart had never forgotten. Around them, the world disappeared. There was no audience, no crown, no shame, no soot, only him, only her, only this moment. "You don't speak," he finally said, as they spun beneath a cascade of light. "Should I be worried?" She tilted her head, teasing. "I thought you preferred mystery." He laughed, and it was warm, unpolished, real. "I suppose I do," he admitted. She studied his face, memorizing it, the quiet kindness in his eyes, the crease in his cheek when he smiled. He looked not like a prince in a storybook, but like someone who had known loss and still dared to love. "I've seen you before," he said quietly. Cinderella's breath caught. He continued, "Not in real life, not until tonight, but in dreams. Strange, isn't it?" She looked down, suddenly shy. "Not strange," she said. He pulled her closer. "Will you tell me your name?" Cinderella hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. To speak her real name now, to give it freely, felt like offering her whole soul. And yet, wasn't that what she had longed for all along? To be known? To be seen, not as a servant or a mystery, but as herself? She looked up. "I'll tell you, at midnight," she said. He raised a brow. "A riddle, then?" "A promise," she replied. They danced on, time folded around them, soft as velvet. Outside, the moon climbed higher. Inside, the chandeliers burned brighter. As the hour neared 11, Cinderella felt the magic begin to whisper in her bones. "Not yet," she begged silently. "Not yet." But the clock was merciless. With trembling lips, she turned to him. "I have to step out for a moment." He looked pained. "Will you come back?" "Yes," she promised. "I'll come back." She left the ballroom, heart thudding like wings against a window. Through a corridor of columns, past portraits that watched her like old ghosts, she moved toward the grand staircase. The wind greeted her as she emerged into the night. Henry waited, but her foot caught on the top step. One slipper slipped free and tumbled into the snow. She gasped, but didn't stop. Henry opened the carriage door. The horses reared. She glanced back once. The prince had emerged into the doorway. He saw her fleeing, golden skirts caught in moonlight. Saw the slipper, and then she was gone. Racing down moonlit roads, the night swallowing her whole, snow fell like memories, quiet, persistent, full of meaning. Cinderella stood at the edge of her mother's garden once more, her breath visible in the cold air, her heart still spinning from the dance. The world had gone still, yet her soul was dancing still, swaying to the invisible music of a night she could hardly believe had been real. She reached down and gathered her skirts. They were no longer made of stardust, just fabric now. The velvet cloak was gone. The diamonds had faded. But one slipper, glass, perfect, impossibly real, remained cradled in her palm. How? The magic had vanished at midnight, as her godmother had warned, but the slipper stayed, tangible proof that the night had happened. She clutched it close, as if it could keep the memory warm. Inside the house, silence reigned. Her stepsisters had not yet returned. Even the cook was asleep. Only Henry padded beside her, tail wagging gently, his eyes never leaving her face. They walked together back into the home, like two survivors returning from battle. Quiet, changed, and slightly dazed. In her little bedroom, Cinderella tucked the slipper beneath her dresser and crawled beneath her quilt. The stars outside had disappeared behind low clouds, but she carried their light within her still. And when she slept, she dreamed, not of carriages or crowns, but of kindness, of dancing not for show, but for joy, of being held not as a prize, but as a person. She dreamed of Edward. The next morning arrived with a sky white as porcelain and silence thick as wool. When Cinderella woke, the memory of the ball was like a flame under her ribs, warm, flickering, impossible to forget. She peeked outside. Her stepsister's carriage had returned in the small hours, its wheels leaving broken lines in the snow. But inside the house, the ladies had not stirred. It was as if even their complaints had frozen overnight. She moved quietly through her chores, humming softly, not out of obligation, but because the world felt different now, as if something sacred had been touched. In the hallway, she heard Agnes mutter bitterly behind a closed door. 3 balls and nothing, not even a dance with him. Imogen snorted, and she showed up again, that same woman, dazzling and smug. "Who is she?" Agnes hissed. "No one even knows her name." Cinderella paused, cloth in hand, and smiled to herself. Let them wonder. She was used to being unseen. It was strange and lovely to be remembered. Later that day, just as the light turned gold, a coach approached from the road. But not just any coach. It gleamed, gilded trim, royal crest, polished windows, and from its door stepped Prince Edward. Cinderella watched from the shadows of the stairwell, heart pounding. He had come, but not for her. Not yet. He entered with quiet grace, followed by a footman holding something delicately in his gloved hands, a single glass slipper. Lydia swooned into curtsies. Agnes and Imogen tripped over one another in their rush to be seen.
"She's upstairs!"
Lydia cried.
"My daughter! The girl you danced with! It must have been one of them!"
Cinderella's breath caught. Upstairs, Agnes and Imogen were whispering, arguing about who would try the slipper first. Their quarrel grew louder until finally, with an exasperated huff, Imogen declared herself the chosen one and swept into the room below. The footman offered the shoe. Imogen lifted her foot. It did not fit. No amount of pushing, twisting, or dramatic sighing would force her foot into its delicate frame. Agnes tried next. Same result. The prince stood back quietly, polite, but unmoved. Then something unexpected happened. From the top of the staircase came the soft clicking of claws on wood. Henry. In his mouth, he carried something that sparkled. The second slipper. The room froze. The prince's gaze followed the dog's gentle trot to the bottom of the stairs, where Henry sat proudly and placed the slipper at his feet. Silence stretched. Then Edward turned. "Is there another young woman in this house?" he asked, his voice calm but resolute. Lydia stammered. "Just the help, Your Highness. A servant girl. Not anyone of note." Edward's eyes narrowed, not unkindly, but with purpose. "I'd like to see her." Agnes and Imogen looked to one another. And then, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of some final flicker of decency, Agnes turned and whispered, "She's in my room, locked in." The key was fetched, the door opened, and Cinderella stepped out. Not in silks, not in starlight, just herself, wearing her old dress, hair unadorned, heart visible in her eyes. The prince met her gaze. It was her. Of course it was. He stepped forward and knelt, offering the slipper with reverence. She took the other from Henry, placing both side by side. Perfect match. He rose. "Arabella," she said softly, voice shaking. "That's my real name." Edward smiled, and in that moment, the magic wasn't in the slippers or the dress or the stars. It was in being seen, and being loved anyway. The house had never been so still. Arabella stood in the front parlor beside Prince Edward, the two of them like a painting. Still, radiant, full of quiet understanding. The fire flickered behind them, its light dancing across the polished floor like a whisper of old dreams. Henry lay at her feet, tail thumping softly, his role as messenger complete. Lydia stood frozen by the staircase, mouth half open, eyes darting from slipper to servant girl to royal visitor. Agnes leaned against the wall, pale and unsure. Imogen had retreated entirely, hiding her flushed cheeks behind a handkerchief that could not mask the storm in her eyes. None of them spoke. Edward broke the silence first. "Arabella," he said, as though testing how it felt to say her name aloud. She looked up at him, heart pounding like a bird in her chest. "I don't know where your magic comes from," he said gently, "but I know truth when I see it. And I know that every moment I've spent with you, whether in moonlight or mystery, has been the most real thing I've known." Tears shimmered in Arabella's eyes. No one had ever looked at her like this, like she wasn't a burden or a ghost in her own house, but something radiant, something wanted. "Your Highness," Lydia interjected sharply, her voice trembling. "Surely there's been some mistake." "There has," he said softly, but firmly. "A mistake in thinking this house belonged to cruelty, when all along it hid someone full of grace." Lydia fell silent. Arabella glanced around the room that had once belonged to her mother. The same walls that had watched her scrub floors were now hearing her name spoken like a promise. She thought of the garden just outside the window, of the hazel tree, of laughter that once bloomed there. "I can't pretend I'm anything I'm not," she said at last, voice steady. "I have no riches. I've spent more time washing dresses than wearing them." "And yet," Edward replied with a smile, "you've been the richest woman in every room you've entered." He reached into his coat and unfolded a small velvet pouch. Inside gleamed her mother's wedding ring. Arabella gasped. "I had a feeling it might matter to you," he said. "Cook found it hidden behind the books in your father's library. I thought perhaps—" She took it, hands trembling. "It was hers," she whispered. "She must have hidden it during the worst of times." Edward stepped closer. "Will you wear it again?" he asked softly. "Not for her past, but for our future?" Arabella's breath caught. "Yes," she said. "Yes." The word echoed in her soul like church bells. Later that week, Arabella packed her few belongings. She didn't have much, just a few dresses, some old books, a lock of her mother's hair wrapped in ribbon, and Henry, of course, who followed her every step with ears alert and tail high. Cook embraced her at the door, eyes watery with pride. "You've always been a light in this house," she whispered. "Now go and shine where the world can see you." Arabella smiled. "I will, and I'll send for you." Cook shook her head, pressing a small pouch into Arabella's hand. "You'll always have someone watching out for you." Inside was a pressed flower from the garden, one of the first her mother had ever planted. She tucked it close to her heart. The palace was not what she expected. It was grand, yes, but it was also warm, not just in fire and fabric, but in people. The seamstresses were kind, the footmen cheerful, and the queen, though regal and poised, had eyes that softened when she saw how gently Arabella treated her son. "I see why he chose you," the queen said one morning. "He doesn't need a crown to match his. He needed someone with a compass." Arabella curtsied, unsure what to say. But something passed between them, a recognition. One queen to another, even if the title hadn't yet been granted. The wedding was held in the palace chapel. Snow had just begun to melt, and tiny buds appeared on the vines curling along the windowsills, an echo of spring, of beginnings. Arabella wore a gown of silver silk, not made by fairies, but by loving hands. Her mother's tiara rested on her head, delicate and gleaming, like memory itself. Malcolm stood by her side. Yes, her father had returned. Found at last by Edward's men, he had survived storms, sickness, and years of separation. When Arabella saw him walk into the room, whole and alive, the world tipped sideways and then righted itself again. They wept in each other's arms, not from grief, but from joy, the kind that only comes when the impossible becomes real. "You were never lost," she told him, "not to me." And he whispered, "You were never forgotten, not for a moment." After the vows, after the feasting, after the laughter and songs, Arabella stepped away into the quiet of the royal gardens. She found a bench beneath a tree that reminded her of home. Henry curled up beside her. The stars blinked gently above. And then, softly, without warning, a wind stirred the petals around her. A glow shimmered through the branches. She turned. There stood her godmother, no longer shimmering in light, but solid, smiling, ageless. "Arabella," she said, "you did not need magic to find your way." Arabella rose and bowed deeply. "But your kindness," the woman said, "that was the spell." Then, just like that, she was gone. But Arabella didn't feel the loss. She only felt fullness. Love, after all, is the truest magic. And now it was hers forever. And so, the girl they once called by a name that wasn't hers rose from ashes to become the woman an entire kingdom would one day bow to. Not because of glass slippers, not because of magic, but because she held on to kindness, even when the world forgot her. Arabella's story reminds us, no matter what name the world gives you, your real name, your true destiny, is still remembered in heaven. Thank you for staying with us tonight. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, a comment, or simply a soft breath before sleep. And remember, sometimes what awakens a life is not magic, but a memory that never left.